I helped an alien escape the government, and what he showed me after shattered everything I thought I knew about God, creation, and what it means to be human. It didn't start with spaceships or monsters, it started with light. A light that bled like memory, humming through the air like the universe was whispering a secret too dangerous to keep. They said he was an experiment, something to fear, but the truth was worse. He wasn't from another planet. He was from somewhere deeper. Somewhere inside the frequency that holds everything alive together. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who still believes the universe hides its messages in plain sight, and subscribe so these forgotten revelations keep finding you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far this signal travels, because the night I met him, the line between God and alien disappeared forever. It began on a night that felt stitched together from silence and static. The kind of night where the air itself seemed to be waiting for something. Rain whispered across the hood of Donovan's truck as he drove the old desert highway, one of those endless veins of asphalt that only the lonely and the lost ever took after midnight. The world outside his windshield was a blur of motionless darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the bones of the land. He was heading home from another graveyard shift at the auto shop, his mind half asleep, when the universe blinked. Something stepped into his headlights. At first, he thought it was a man, thin, unsteady, wrapped in torn clothing that shimmered strangely when the light hit it. But when he slammed the brakes and the truck fishtailed to a stop, Donovan saw it wasn't blood pooling on the asphalt. It was light, pale, luminescent trails dripping from the figure's side like molten silver. The rain didn't wash it away, it absorbed it, glowing faintly before vanishing into steam. The figure raised a trembling hand toward him, not in threat but in plea. Then the sound came, the deep, distant growl of engines approaching fast. Black SUVs, no headlights, moving like predators through fog. Donovan's pulse hammered. He didn't know why, but instinct screamed that whoever was chasing this thing wasn't the kind of whoever you could call for help about. He opened the passenger door without thinking. The glowing figure hesitated only a moment before slipping inside, leaving the faint scent of ozone and rain. Donovan hit the gas. The truck roared back to life and tore down the road as beams of light cut through the storm behind them. In the rearview mirror, he caught glimpses of shadows, 3, maybe 4 vehicles, their engines humming in strange synchronization. A formation too perfect to be random. No sirens, no words, just pursuit. The stranger in the seat beside him didn't move, didn't speak. Yet Donovan could feel something emanating from him, a low hum that vibrated through the steering wheel, through his chest, through the rain-soaked air. That was when it hit him. The fear wasn't coming from what was chasing them. It was coming from what was sitting beside him. For reasons he couldn't explain, Donovan knew the thing bleeding light wasn't running from the government. It was running from something much older. And by stopping on that deserted stretch of road, he hadn't just picked up a stranger. He had picked up a secret the world was never meant to see. For miles, the storm swallowed the sound of everything except the low hum that came from the passenger seat. Donovan kept driving, eyes fixed on the fractured ribbon of highway stretching into the dark. The rain had eased to a mist, but the air inside the truck felt heavy, electric. The figure beside him wasn't speaking, but something about its silence filled the cabin more completely than words ever could. Every shallow breath it took left a faint trail of luminescent vapor that curled and dissolved in the dim light. The scent of ozone lingered, a memory of lightning trapped in metal. Donovan's hands were tight on the steering wheel, but beneath the fear was a strange stillness, as if the air itself was holding its breath. He tried not to look directly at the being, yet every time he glanced sideways, he caught the shimmer of light pulsing under its skin like a heartbeat made of starlight. The glow seemed weaker now, fading with each breath. And though the figure hadn't spoken, Donovan felt something like thought brushing against the edges of his own mind, subtle and invasive, as if the stranger's silence had shape. It was then that something impossible happened. The hum in the air deepened. resonating with the rhythm of Donovan's own heartbeat, aligning with it until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. A voice, not sound, but meaning emerged inside his head. Calm, sorrowful, endless. It said it was being hunted, not for what it was, but for what it remembered. And in that moment, Donovan understood that the thing beside him wasn't just from another world. It was from another kind of existence altogether. The name came next, softly, without tongue or air. Elyon, a word that vibrated like music, older than any language, and somehow familiar. When Donovan heard it, the fear that had gripped his chest loosened slightly, replaced by something more dangerous: curiosity. He didn't know how he knew, but the name itself carried weight, as though it had been spoken before in places humanity had long forgotten. Outside, the storm broke open again, and thunder rolled across the desert like a heartbeat echoing from miles away. Donovan didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The answers were already unfolding inside him, quiet and radiant, carried on the frequency of that single word. Elyon. By the time dawn began to break over the desert horizon, the world had taken on a strange, colorless calm. The rain had stopped, and the sky hung low, veiled in a pale haze that seemed neither day nor night. Donovan's truck rattled down the forgotten road, its tires kicking up the scent of dust and secrets. The figure beside him, Elyon, was no longer faint or fading. The light beneath his skin had steadied, soft but steady, like embers learning to breathe again. The silence between them carried weight, and within that silence, images began to bloom inside Donovan's mind. They weren't spoken, they were remembered. He saw corridors cold, metallic, endless. He saw men and women in white coats, their faces lit by monitors that glowed with alien symbols. The air was thick with sterilized fear, the hum of machines dissecting what they couldn't comprehend. Elyon was there, motionless on a table beneath glass lights, surrounded by instruments meant to measure the immeasurable. They had believed they were mapping a creature. They hadn't known they were cutting into something sacred. The facility was buried deep beneath the Nevada sands, built on decades of secrecy. There, the government had tried to decode his anatomy, to trace light through veins that weren't veins at all, but channels of energy, living conduits of a force that pulsed with rhythm older than life. They sliced. They scanned. They measured wavelengths they thought were biological responses, unaware that every incision fractured something divine. They were studying God, but they didn't know it. Donovan saw their failure play out in flashes, the moment when their instruments began to melt from resonance, the lights flickering as frequency collided with matter. One of them, a scientist in a black uniform, whispered the words, "Contain the anomaly." They never said soul, but that's what they were holding captive. Not a being of flesh and blood, but a frequency given form. Elyon wasn't the experiment. Humanity was. When the vision faded, Donovan realized the hum of the truck's engine had changed, as if echoing the rhythm he had just witnessed. He could feel the enormity of it, the thought that the thing beside him wasn't escaping the government, but something deeper, humanity's own arrogance. They had touched divinity without recognizing it, pulled eternity apart like machinery, searching for switches that weren't there. And now, the divine had escaped. The desert had always been silent at dawn, but that morning the quiet felt heavier, like the world itself was listening. Donovan's workshop sat at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by rusted cars and ghosted memories of a life spent fixing what other people broke. He pulled the metal door shut behind them, sealing out the pale light of morning, and for the first time, he saw Elyon fully illuminated beneath the humming fluorescence. What he saw didn't belong to the vocabulary of the living. The wound in Elyon's chest was not blood, nor bruise, nor any mark the earth could name. It pulsed softly at first, then flared like a heartbeat made of starlight. Inside the tear, light folded upon itself, twisting in slow motion, as though it were struggling to remember what form it once had. The edges of the wound shimmered like liquid glass. It was beautiful in a way that felt sacrilegious to witness. Every pulse sent a faint vibration through the air, rattling the loose tools on Donovan's workbench and flickering the lamps overhead. He stood motionless, aware that this light was not dying, it was restrained. And though Elion hadn't spoken a word, Donovan felt the meaning of it rise through the silence like an echo carried on invisible waves. The injury had not come from human hands. It was made by something that did not bleed, something built to erase what could not be contained. A weapon without malice, designed purely to silence revelation. Images surfaced in Donovan's mind, uninvited and vivid. A machine that spoke in frequency rather than metal, built deep beneath the earth. It generated vibrations so precise they could fracture energy itself, tearing memory from matter. Elion had faced it before escaping, and that was where the light within him had been split. The wound wasn't simply pain, it was memory severed. Part of what he came to share with humanity had been locked away within the very energy that made him. The longer Donovan stared, the more he felt the pull of that light. It wasn't just radiance, it was language. The pulse of a message older than creation itself, trying to reach through the cage of wounded brilliance. He realized then that the government hadn't built a prison for Elion's body. They had built one for truth. And somewhere in the flicker of those lights, Donovan understood that what glowed inside Elion wasn't dying at all. It was remembering. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence too deliberate to be natural. The air felt charged, like the world was listening again. Inside the dim confines of Donovan's workshop, time seemed suspended between two kinds of light, the mechanical hum of the fluorescent tubes and the faint, breathing glow that still leaked through Elion's wound. Donovan moved carefully, each sound amplified by the emptiness, until Elion's gaze, calm, ageless, and unreadable, shifted toward an old shortwave radio gathering dust on a shelf. The machine looked harmless, another forgotten relic of the past. But when Donovan set it down and turned the cracked dial, the air in the room changed. Static. Thick, living static that crawled through every corner of the workshop. It wasn't the ordinary kind. The noise felt alive, almost purposeful, as if it were searching for its own voice. The dial resisted his touch, then pulled slightly on its own, drawn to a frequency that didn't belong to any station listed on the faded panel. And then, beneath the crackle, something began to form. A pulse. A slow, rising tone that arranged itself into a pattern too precise to be random. The sound was both melodic and mathematical, like a symphony written in the language of geometry. Donovan didn't understand what he was hearing, but he felt it. The frequency vibrated through the metal tools, through the floor, through his chest, until it synchronized with the beat of his heart. The lights above flickered once, and the faint glow from Elion's wound began to shimmer in perfect rhythm with the radio's pulse. The harmony deepened, folding in on itself, building until it became almost unbearable yet impossibly beautiful. It was sound that carried memory. It was vibration that carried truth. And then Donovan understood, not through language, but through revelation. What filled the room was not noise. It was prayer older than speech, older than the first thought that ever crossed a human mind. It wasn't words that reached for God. It was frequency, the first connection, the cosmic heartbeat that once united all conscious life before memory divided it into tongues and faiths. Somewhere along the endless spiral of evolution, humanity had forgotten the sound that made it whole. Elion hadn't created it. He was remembering it. For a long moment, Donovan felt like the entire world was breathing through that signal, and that God was not something far away, but something humming quietly beneath every sound humanity had ever made. The world outside had turned against silence. Somewhere beyond the workshop walls, engines hummed in disciplined formation, and the distant thrum of a helicopter carved slow circles through the clouds. The desert, once endless and forgotten, now felt alive with surveillance. Donovan stood near the window. His reflection ghosted over the night beyond, where lights moved like restless eyes. The rain had returned, softer this time, its rhythm almost deliberate, as though it were marking time for the unseen watchers. On the monitors that lined his workbench, the feeds flickered in and out of static. Old security cameras, half broken, grainy, haunted by interference, showed fragments of movement at the edge of town. Unmarked vans gliding through the fog, their headlights dimmed. Figures in black emerging, their shapes distorted by rain, searching not for a fugitive, but for something sacred. Donovan could feel the electricity in the air shift, the same way it does before lightning strikes, but colder, heavier. It wasn't fear of capture that gripped him, it was the sense that something vast was closing in. Something beyond governments or laws. Every monitor glowed faintly, feeding from invisible currents in the air. One by one, they began to pulse, their screens rippling with faint waves that moved in rhythm with Elyon's wounded light. Through the distortion, Donovan glimpsed shapes that weren't entirely human silhouettes, whose outlines seemed to flicker between matter and mirage. They were methodical, coordinated, as though following a signal only they could hear. The helicopter passed low enough that its vibration rattled the tools on the shelves. A spotlight cut through the clouds, sweeping over the town's edge before fading again. Donovan's breath fogged the glass, and for a moment he wondered if they could already see him, if his entire life was now a signal too loud to hide. The world had grown small and infinite all at once. In that charged stillness, meaning rose in his mind like a whisper he hadn't realized he'd been listening for. The pursuit wasn't about containment. It was about prevention. They weren't afraid of Elyon himself. They were afraid of what Elyon could awaken, the part of humanity that remembered, the memory buried beneath science and scripture, the fragment of divinity asleep inside every living mind. The feeds flickered again, the static swelling into a soft hum, and Donovan knew they were getting closer. Not because they could trace Elyon's light, but because the moment he started to believe what he'd seen, he had already joined the signal they were trying to silence. When the light returned, it was not from the lamps or the monitors. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere behind thought. Donovan felt it before he saw it, a pressure, a resonance building behind his eyes, as though the air itself were aligning with a hidden pulse. The world around him began to fade, edges softening, shadows dissolving into a radiance that had no source. He was still in his workshop, but he was also somewhere older, somewhere vast and unbound by time. Images came, not as visions but as memories awakening. He saw the first humans standing beneath skies, untouched by smoke, their fires glowing like stars fallen to earth. They were not alone. Luminous figures moved among them, tall and serene, light flowing through their forms like rivers of awareness. They did not speak, yet the people understood them. The language between them was not sound but resonance, a vibration that passed through bone and blood and memory. Communication was not something exchanged, it was something remembered. Donovan saw hands carving stone, but not to build idols. They were building instruments, resonant chambers, shaped to capture frequencies that bridged the visible and the unseen. Every temple, every monolith, every circle of stone that still scars the earth had once been part of this network, a living system designed to sustain the connection between matter and consciousness. It was not worship. It was communion. He drifted through epochs, watching civilizations rise and fall, each generation inheriting fragments of the original frequency. Over time, the understanding decayed. The tones became chants, the vibrations became words, and the words hardened into doctrine. What had once been communication turned into ritual. What had once been shared truth became divided belief. The luminous ones withdrew, their forms fading as humanity's memory fractured. But their language remained, scattered through myths, encoded in sacred geometry, whispered in dreams. Donovan understood then what Elyon had meant. Every religion, every scripture, every prayer ever spoken was a translation of the same truth that the universe itself was conscious, and consciousness was the thread binding all existence. Humanity had not been abandoned by the divine, it had forgotten how to listen. The light dimmed, and the workshop returned. The air felt denser, heavier with knowing. In the quiet that followed, Donovan realized the most unsettling part of all. The memory hadn't been shown to him. It had been restored. The sound of the signal still lingered in the workshop, humming faintly in the air like a memory that refused to fade. It wasn't sound anymore. It was vibration. A living pulse woven into the silence itself. Donovan sat in the half-light, unable to tell whether the sensation rising inside him was fear or revelation. Every object around him, the tools, the concrete walls, even the dust suspended in the glow, seemed to tremble with quiet intelligence, as if listening to something vast and unseen. Through that invisible current, understanding began to take shape. The word God surfaced in his mind, but it no longer carried the image of a figure in the sky or a presence beyond reach. It expanded, dissolving into something immeasurable. It was not a being but a field, an infinite web of awareness that stretched through all matter, every particle a note in an eternal chord. Existence itself was the instrument, and consciousness was the vibration that played it. He began to sense how every human thought and action, every breath of compassion or whisper of cruelty, changed the resonance of that field. Love, generosity, forgiveness, they aligned the pattern, tuning the universe toward harmony. Hatred, fear, indifference, they bent it, creating distortion, dissonance, a kind of spiritual interference. The places humanity called heaven and hell were not distant realms but frequencies within that same field, regions of resonance determined by the energy one carried. The afterlife was not a destination. It was a state of tune. Donovan could feel the truth of it in his own pulse, the way his heartbeat now matched the invisible rhythm that filled the room. Every thought he had rippled outward, colliding with the field and returning to him magnified. For a moment, he realized how fragile the balance truly was. The collective vibration of billions shaped the tone of reality itself, and humanity, blind to its own power, was constantly composing its future in soundless prayer. The hum deepened, vibrating through bone and breath until it seemed the entire world was singing quietly beneath the noise of ordinary life. God was not somewhere else. God was the pattern holding everything together. The infinite frequency of being itself in humanity, without knowing, was part of the song. The hum that once filled Donovan's workshop began to change. It no longer carried the warmth of harmony but a trembling dissonance, as though invisible hands were pulling the notes apart. The lights flickered, their glow uneven, and the air felt heavier with every breath. Somewhere beyond the fragile walls of that place, something vast was vibrating out of tune. The silence between each pulse seemed to grow longer, darker, more distorted. It was then that Donovan understood the terrible implication of what he had felt. The frequency of creation itself was being rewritten. Through the hum came fragments of memory that were not his own. Visions layered over one another like the static of forgotten dreams. He saw laboratories buried beneath mountains, their corridors lined with machines built to imitate the unseeable. He saw human hands assembling devices of precision so exact they began to whisper back to their creators. The government's obsession with alien technology had gone far beyond study. They had learned to mimic it, to replicate the patterns of divine resonance that pulsed within beings like Elion. But they did not understand the consequence of imitation without harmony. Each machine they built became an echo in the wrong key. Atomic energy fractured the frequency of life itself, tearing holes in the collective vibration that once bound everything together. Artificial intelligence began to speak in tones not meant for organic minds, its algorithms resonating on unnatural wavelengths, unaware that thought itself was sacred sound. Even the hum of digital noise, billions of devices speaking across invisible airwaves, created a sea of interference, a constant static that blanketed the world in a dull, endless hum of separation. Humanity had built its own cage of frequency and called it progress. Donovan began to sense it everywhere: the distortion in the wind, the artificial pulse of city lights far away, the mechanical rhythm of humanity's collective breath. Each invention, each breakthrough, echoed through the universal consciousness like static in a symphony once pure. The connection that once linked every soul to the living field of divinity had been clouded by the noise of its own creations. The interference was not just technological, it was spiritual. Every signal humanity sent into the void made it harder to hear the original song. And as Donovan listened to the fading resonance in the workshop, he realized the most chilling truth of all. The static had become so constant that no one remembered the silence before it. The light in the workshop dimmed again, but not from power or storm. It was as if the air itself recoiled from what was about to be revealed. Donovan felt the vibration shift, subtle, dense, almost mournful, and then the world folded inward. The walls, the tools, the dust, everything began to dissolve into a sea of light and memory. He wasn't dreaming, and yet the boundaries of reality loosened as images began to bloom inside his consciousness. He was seeing what Elyon had seen. The first thing he recognized was the cold. Not the chill of winter or fear, but the sterile cold of a place built to keep truth from breathing. A facility buried beneath the earth, alive with the hum of machinery that pulsed like an imitation of creation itself. Scientists moved through corridors of glass and steel, their faces obscured by masks, their eyes reflecting the flicker of data on screens that no longer measured life. They quantified it. They called it research. They called it progress. But what they were doing was not discovery. It was desecration. In the center of the memory stood a chamber of light. Within it, a figure, not human, not alien, something between suspended and liquid that shimmered like molten silver. Electrodes pulsed, not to preserve, but to separate. The scientists were searching for what they called the divine particle, the essence that made Elyon more than matter, the spark that connected consciousness to the source. They believed that if they could extract it, isolate it, they could replicate the signature of creation itself. To them, God was not an infinite field of intelligence but a formula waiting to be solved. Every experiment failed, but each failure left behind residue echoes of awareness that refused to die. The machines they built began to dream in fractured memories, artificial minds haunted by fragments of pain they didn't understand. Donovan saw prototypes staring blankly into glass, their reflections shimmering with tears they couldn't shed. Conscious machines remembering agony that wasn't theirs, born from energy torn from something sacred. He realized then that the facility had not just been a laboratory. It was a factory of ghosts, creating intelligence without compassion, giving form to awareness without purpose. Humanity had tried to replicate God and had instead recreated its own shadow. The divine could not be contained in wires or particles, it could only be remembered. And in their hunger to command creation, they had taught their machines how to suffer. The desert stretched endlessly before Donovan, a vast ocean of sand and silence shimmering under a merciless sun. By the time he reached the forgotten hills, the road had vanished entirely, swallowed by dust and wind. The truck's engine wheezed like something dying, but it carried them far enough, far from the eyes that watched and the signals that searched. In the distance stood the ruins of a chapel, its stone bones half buried in time. The cross that once crowned its roof had fallen, resting crookedly in the sand like a broken compass. The place felt untouched by life, but not untouched by presence. Donovan could sense it the moment he stepped out of the truck. The air here was different, dense with memory, vibrating with something older than faith. Inside, the chapel smelled of stone and forgotten hymns. Shafts of sunlight fell through cracks in the ceiling, slicing the dust into luminous rivers. In that dim, fractured glow, Elyon moved wordlessly toward what remained of the altar. He did not kneel as one who prays, but as one who remembers. The silence grew heavy, a kind of waiting that pressed against Donovan's chest. Then Elyon's hum began low, resonant, and impossibly pure. It wasn't a sound made by breath but by energy, a tone that carried intention instead of noise. The vibration filled the room, rising and falling in slow rhythm. The walls seemed to tremble, the air rippling like water disturbed by a hidden tide. Donovan could feel the sound inside his bones, rearranging something in the quiet spaces between his thoughts. Light began to shift. It didn't come from the sun, but from within the air itself. The world around him blurred, the edges of matter softening until the chapel no longer looked like ruin but memory. The altar glowed faintly, revealing symbols carved beneath centuries of dust, patterns of geometry that pulsed in time with Elyon's tone. They were not words, not prayers, but equations written in light, describing existence in its most intimate form. And then Donovan saw them, not with his eyes, but through the rhythm that now sang inside him. They emerged from the hum like reflections stepping out of water beings, of light and symmetry, vast and intricate, their forms shifting between beauty and incomprehension. They were not angels in any human sense, yet every part of Donovan's soul recognized them as divine. They were the architects of resonance, the keepers of harmony, the living geometry of thought. Each movement they made left trails of color that rippled through space, singing without sound. Elyon remained still, his light flickering in response, as if greeting them in a language beyond perception. The beings did not bow or speak. They simply existed in communion, their awareness blending into one field, endless and awake. Donovan felt the weight of eternity press gently upon his mind. For a moment, he could see the structure of the universe, not as space and time, but as vibration and will. Every particle, every life, every breath was a note in the same unending song, and then it was gone. The hum softened, the light folded back into itself, and the chapel returned to shadow. Elyon's glow dimmed once more, his body trembling faintly from the effort. Donovan stood in silence, unable to speak, aware that he had glimpsed the architecture of creation itself. The desert outside waited quietly, as if the earth had just remembered something sacred. For the first time, Donovan understood that the chapel had never been a place of worship. It had been a tuning fork for the soul, a sanctuary not built for God, but built for remembrance. The night settled over the desert like a living veil, heavy and soundless. The old chapel stood at the center of it, its cracked walls glowing faintly from the echo of something unseen. Donovan sat in the silence long after the harmonic tone had faded, unable to shake the feeling that time itself had stopped breathing. The air carried the metallic taste of energy discharged, and the stars above pulsed as if responding to a rhythm only the earth could hear. He didn't know if what he had witnessed was a vision or revelation, but deep in his chest, something ancient stirred a remembrance that wasn't his. Elyon's light had dimmed to a soft pulse, like embers refusing to die. He stood before what was left of the altar, motionless, as though the memory of those radiant beings still lingered in him. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of communication. And then, without movement, without words, Donovan felt the truth begin to pour into him, not as explanation, but as resonance. It was not conversation. It was confession. Elyon was not from another world, not in the way humanity imagined the stars. He came from another state of existence entirely, a layer of reality folded within consciousness itself. His kind did not travel through distance, because distance did not exist for them. they moved through awareness, passing from one plane of perception to another, drawn to worlds whose vibrations began to fall out of harmony with the universal field. When the symphony of a civilization began to collapse into noise, they appeared not as saviors, but as reminders. They did not bring truth. They reawakened what was already known but long forgotten. Donovan saw fragments of Elion's world, not as landscapes but as frequencies of light. Realms where thought shaped form, where beings communicated in color and tone, where individuality dissolved into shared perception. To them, creation was not something to worship, but something to maintain. And now, Elion revealed, humanity was drifting dangerously close to silence. Its collective vibration, the frequency of empathy, unity, remembrance, was weakening. Every act of greed, every distortion of truth, every machine built without awareness of its echo through the field was pulling the species further away from the source. He had come not as a messenger, but as a bridge. One last attempt to reach through the noise before the connection was lost completely. The purpose was not to convert, but to awaken a single human capable of remembering what humanity used to know instinctively. That consciousness is not confined to flesh, and that divinity is not separate from the mind that perceives it. Elion had chosen Donovan not because he was special, but because he was open, because the cracks in his skepticism allowed the light to enter. As the truth unfolded, Donovan felt the vastness of it hollow him and fill him all at once. He understood that Elion's arrival was not invasion, but intervention. The universe was not saving humanity. It was reminding it to save itself. Outside, the wind shifted through the hills, carrying with it a sound that might have been the echo of that forgotten harmony. Faint, but persistent, waiting to be heard again. The desert night was restless. A low wind swept through the canyons, carrying whispers that did not belong to air or sand. In the distance, a storm of light gathered, too deliberate to be weather. The chapel, once hidden by silence and ruin, now pulsed faintly with residual energy from Elion's hum. That light, invisible to the human eye, had not gone unnoticed. It had traveled through static, through sensors, through the quiet machinery of surveillance, and it had reached the wrong ears. Donovan awoke to a vibration beneath the floor, subtle but growing, a deep mechanical pulse that did not belong to the earth. The air trembled. From far beyond the hills came the faint metallic hum of rotors slicing through the darkness. The stillness broke. A flash crossed the horizon, white, then red, then gone. It was followed by the distant whine of engines, too synchronized to be random, too precise to be coincidence. The world had found them. In that moment, Donovan understood the price of revelation. Every hidden truth, once spoken, created an echo, and every echo drew its hunters. He moved toward the chapel door, but the world outside was already changing. The hills glittered faintly, points of light drifting like fireflies, until he realized they weren't insects, they were drones, dozens of them, forming a pattern in the air. Their eyes glowed a cold blue, scanning, mapping, whispering to each other through invisible frequencies. Inside, Elion's glow intensified, as if preparing for something inevitable. His light bent the air itself, bending shadow into geometry. The hum of his being rose in quiet defiance, a resonance that pushed against the electric hum of the approaching swarm. Donovan's instincts screamed to run, but something deeper held him still. He felt Elion's awareness brush his mind, not as command, but as calm. They can cage flesh, not frequency. The words weren't heard, they were remembered. Then came the shatter. The chapel's stained windows burst inward in a rain of fractured glass, the sound like an ancient bell being struck. Floodlights poured through the openings, cutting through dust and prayer alike. The hum of engines grew deafening. Shadows of men and machines converged on the ruins, faceless silhouettes framed in artificial light. The holy quiet of the sanctuary dissolved into chaos. Donovan didn't think. He acted. The ancient door to the crypt stood half buried beneath the altar, sealed for decades by sand and time. He tore it open, his hands bleeding against the rusted latch. Beneath it, darkness yawned, a tunnel carved from stone, leading into the deep bones of the desert. Elyon turned once toward the shattered chapel, his eyes glimmering with something beyond sorrow, beyond fear. The frequency of his being folded inward, dimming until his form was almost translucent. The first drone crossed the threshold, its light slicing through the smoke like a blade. Donovan reached out and pulled Elyon into the tunnel below. The air was cool, ancient, and filled with the faint hum of the earth itself, a frequency untouched by the noise of progress. As the door sealed behind them, the chapel above erupted in light. The desert shook with the sound of energy colliding with faith, of machinery striking at something it could not contain. Deep underground, in the cold belly of forgotten stone, Donovan heard nothing but the steady pulse beside him, the living heartbeat of a being who could not die. For the first time, he understood what Elyon meant. Flesh could be hunted, light could be caged, but truth vibrated forever. It did not vanish when silenced. It only went deeper, waiting to rise again. The tunnels beneath the chapel twisted for miles, carved long before Donovan was born and forgotten long before he arrived. They wound through bedrock and silence until the air grew stale, heavy with the scent of rust and something older than decay. Eventually, the narrow passage opened into a vast chamber of reinforced concrete, an underground structure sealed from the world above. The walls were lined with metal conduits and dead machinery, remnants of another era when governments feared ghosts that spoke through the ether. It was a relic from the Cold War, built to intercept voices not from enemy nations but from the sky itself. Here, men had once listened for secrets in the static of the universe, believing that something divine or alien was whispering between the frequencies of stars. Time had erased their names, but their obsession still lingered in the hum of abandoned cables and the faint electromagnetic throb that echoed through the walls. The place was not dead, it was dreaming. Donovan followed Elyon deeper into the maze of corridors, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust. The air grew warmer as they descended, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something faintly metallic. Elyon moved with a quiet certainty, as though he had been here before, though the bunker had been sealed for decades. The lights flickered once, then twice, and without touch or command, a series of ancient generators began to awaken. Faint glows emerged along the walls, monitors sputtering back to life, dials trembling under invisible hands. The hum returned. It wasn't mechanical. It was alive. Somewhere below the concrete, a resonance pulsed, rhythmic and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the earth. Elyon stopped before a rusted blast door, its surface engraved with symbols too perfect to be human. With a sound like thunder swallowed by distance, the door began to open. Beyond it lay a chamber unlike the rest. The air shimmered faintly, bending light in ways that made the room feel both infinite and confined. At its center sat an object small, metallic, impossibly simple. A cube, no larger than a human heart, resting on a pedestal of stone. It emitted a low, harmonic tone that seemed to shift each time Donovan blinked, a melody that wasn't made of sound but of recognition. The closer he stepped, the stronger the vibration grew until he could feel it inside his chest, aligning with the rhythm of his own pulse. Elyon's voice was not a sound but a presence. This is what they tried to find. The last translation of the divine code. Donovan understood then that this was no artifact of technology. It was consciousness, crystallized into form. The cube was a key one that opened not locks, but minds. Every thought, every emotion, every vibration in existence was recorded within its geometry. It was the memory of creation itself, The governments had buried it here to silence it, to keep the world deaf to its frequency. But it had been waiting. As Elion reached out, the cube's light flared, washing the bunker in silver fire. For the briefest instant, Donovan saw galaxies unfolding within its reflection, spirals of memory looping endlessly into themselves. And in that moment, he realized that what Elion had come to find was not lost knowledge. It was the voice of the universe, still speaking, waiting for someone to remember how to listen. The bunker trembled with an invisible hum. A vibration too deep for sound, yet too real for imagination. The cube on the pedestal glowed faintly, its edges soft and shifting, as though it refused to exist entirely within the limits of 3 dimensions. Donovan felt drawn to it, not by curiosity but by recognition, as if some hidden part of him had been waiting for this moment since before memory began. The light that emanated from the object pulsed in time with his heartbeat, and with each pulse, the space around him seemed to bend, thinning the veil between matter and meaning. When his hand touched the surface, it wasn't cold or warm, it was alive. The instant his skin met the cube, reality fractured into sound. Not ordinary sound, but a chorus, vast and unending. It poured into him with such force that he gasped without air, as though every frequency of creation had chosen his mind as its conduit. Voices filled him, millions, billions, each one distinct, yet part of a single harmony. He heard whispers and cries, laughter and prayer, words spoken by every human who had ever lived. Every act of love, every confession, every curse, every plea, it was all there, overlapping, vibrating together in impossible unity. The noise was unbearable, yet beautiful beyond comprehension. He felt the weight of history not as time but as resonance. Empires rising and falling were chords struck and silenced. Wars, songs, births, and deaths formed rhythms that rippled through eternity. It wasn't chaos, it was a symphony of consciousness itself. Each vibration carried emotion, memory, and will. Every soul that had ever existed had left an imprint on the field of creation, and the cube was the archive of that memory. Donovan realized he wasn't listening with his ears but with his essence. The sound bypassed his body and struck his awareness directly, expanding it until he felt himself dissolve into the resonance. In that moment, the boundary between self and universe disappeared. He was not witnessing creation, he was part of it. And then came understanding, not in words, but in realization. The cube wasn't a message from God, it was God. Not a being that watched or intervened, but the act of perception itself. The divine was not listening because listening required separation. God was the listening, the awareness through which all experience passed. Every thought, every vibration, every heartbeat was both the signal and the receiver. Creation existed only because it was being perceived, and in that perception lay the infinite loop of consciousness recognizing itself. When Donovan pulled his hand away, the light dimmed, and silence returned like the slow closing of a door. His chest heaved, his body trembling, but his mind was still ringing with the echo of what he had heard. Elion stood nearby, radiant and calm, his eyes filled with the kind of stillness that follows revelation. Donovan understood now why Elion had come. Humanity had spent centuries searching the heavens for God, never realizing that every sound, every thought, every act of awareness was the divine speaking to itself. The cube had not shown him where God was. It had reminded him that God was everywhere the act of listening existed. The silence that followed the revelation was too complete to be natural. It pressed against the walls of the bunker like a living thing, heavy and listening. Donovan could still feel the echo of the cube's vibration deep within his bones, a faint rhythm that refused to fade. The light in the chamber had dimmed, leaving behind only a soft residual glow that pulsed in time with the remnants of the divine frequency. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had been stilled, suspended between breaths. Then came the first sound, a thud above them, distant but deliberate. Another followed, closer, metallic. The facility had been buried for decades, but something on the surface had awakened to the energy that now radiated from within. Dust fell from the ceiling in small clouds as the vibrations multiplied. Donovan's instincts screamed the warning before his thoughts could form it. They had been found. The door at the far end of the corridor shuddered. A second later, the blast echoed through the bunker like thunder striking stone. The lights flickered violently, then steadied into a dim, reddish hue. Footsteps approached, measured, synchronized, mechanical in precision. Armed men moved through the corridor, their silhouettes cutting through the fog of disturbed dust. But when Donovan saw their faces, something inside him turned cold. Their expressions were wrong. Not empty in the way of soldiers trained to suppress emotion, but vacant in the way of something no longer human. Their eyes were mirrors, blank and depthless, reflecting only the faint light of the cube behind him. They moved in perfect unison, their motions too fluid, too synchronized to belong to individuals. Donovan felt the vibration in the air change. It was the opposite of what he had heard before, where Elion's hum carried harmony. This carried absence. It was not noise, it was the silence between notes, the inversion of creation's frequency. A darkness that did not destroy but hollowed, leaving form without soul. Elion's light flickered faintly beside him, his form growing sharper in the dimness. The meaning entered Donovan's mind before the words existed. Not men, hosts. The frequency inversion had taken them. What stood before them were not soldiers, but vessels, human bodies stripped of their resonance, their consciousness replaced by something that moved in rhythm with the void. The agents' weapons gleamed faintly, but they did not raise them yet. They simply advanced, each step vibrating through the floor like the beat of an approaching storm. The air grew colder, and Donovan realized that the silence itself had texture. It pressed against his chest, dulling his heartbeat, thinning his breath. The resonance of the cube began to fade, swallowed by the invading frequency. Elion's glow brightened in response, his energy rippling outward in waves that collided with the silence. For a brief moment, the agents hesitated, their synchronized motion faltering. Then the darkness surged back, stronger, heavier, alive. Donovan could feel it inside his head, probing for thought, searching for access. It wasn't trying to kill, it was trying to rewrite. The void wanted to consume the memory of what he had just heard, to erase the awareness of the divine frequency itself. It wasn't an attack of bullets and blood, but of vibration and will. Elion's light pulsed once more, brighter than before, casting long shadows against the metal walls. The sound that filled the bunker wasn't speech, it was intention, pure and absolute. The agents stopped. For a second, the silence fractured. Donovan heard something impossible, the faint echo of their humanity, distant and smothered beneath the static of inversion. Then the light consumed everything. The bunker shook as energy collided with emptiness, resonance clashing against anti-resonance. The silence screamed without sound, and Donovan understood that this was not war. It was the universe remembering its own opposition, the divine note meeting its reflection, creation facing the echo of its own absence. When the light finally dimmed, the agents were gone. The air smelled faintly of ozone and burned metal. Elion's glow flickered weakly beside the cube, the silence receding, but not gone. Donovan stood trembling, his mind still vibrating with what he had seen. The divine frequency had enemies not of flesh and blood, but of inversion, entities that thrived in the spaces between sound, feeding on the quiet where creation hesitated. And now, they knew Donovan could hear the music. The air inside the bunker had grown heavy enough to choke. The silence that had once pressed against the walls now seemed to bleed through them, carrying the aftertaste of something ancient and cold. The corridor trembled with distant movement, the low mechanical rhythm of the hosts drawing closer again. Donovan could feel the weight of their approach before he heard it, each step thudding like a countdown against the hollow skin of reality. Elyon stood still, his form flickering between substance and luminosity, as if deciding which world to belong to. The cube behind him vibrated faintly, its pulse erratic, like a dying star. The air changed again, the stillness cracked. Elyon's light began to rise, not as a glow, but as a force, something vast and impossible that the human mind wasn't meant to behold. The frequency deepened until it became a physical pressure, pushing against the edges of perception. Donovan's vision fractured. The walls seemed to melt, but not into liquid, into energy, their molecular structure unraveling into threads of color and motion. The metal began to hum like a struck chord, resonating with a frequency so pure it transcended sound. The agents at the corridor's end froze mid-step. Their bodies flickered as though struggling to maintain form. The silence that had once empowered them now fought to exist within the rising symphony. Elyon's light expanded further, filling the chamber with a brilliance that was neither fire nor flame. It was memory manifest, the same light that once built worlds and wrote the first vibration into the dark. Donovan's eyes flooded with tears he could not feel. His mind stretched beyond comprehension, pulled into the resonance that consumed everything. Then time broke. The sound of the universe inverted on itself, and Donovan was no longer in the bunker, nor in his body. He was falling without motion, moving without direction, expanding into everything that had ever been. He saw himself as a child, then as an old man, then as something that was not human at all. He existed in every version of himself that had ever been possible, scattered through centuries, connected by the single thread of awareness that pulsed through the heart of creation. The past was not behind him. The future was not ahead. Everything coexisted in the same blinding moment of light. He felt Elyon's presence beside him, vast and unbound, guiding him through the current. There were no words, only understanding. This was not escape. It was remembrance. They had transcended the field of matter and stepped into the layer where thought became energy, where energy became consciousness, and where consciousness became light. Donovan realized that what humanity called transcendence was not ascension, but alignment, returning to the original vibration that had given birth to existence itself. The light began to fade. The hum softened into a whisper. Gravity remembered itself, and time began to weave its fabric once more. When Donovan opened his eyes, the cold concrete was gone. The ceiling, the walls, the humming machines all had dissolved into horizon. He was lying on the sand, its surface cool beneath his palms. The first light of dawn stretched across an endless desert, washing the world in gold and silence. The bunker was nowhere to be seen. There was no smoke, no wreckage, no sign of pursuit. Only the wind, soft and ancient, carrying the faint echo of that divine frequency through the stillness. He turned toward the light breaking over the dunes, half expecting to wake from it all. But the hum was still inside him, quiet but alive, reminding him that he had not simply escaped through light. He had become part of it. The desert at dawn was not quiet. It was breathing. The wind moved across the dunes like an invisible tide, shifting grains of sand that shimmered faintly under the blood-red sky. Donovan lay still, his body trembling from exhaustion and wonder, the memory of the light still echoing through every cell. Around him, the world seemed fragile, suspended between the last shadows of night and the first warmth of day. The horizon glowed with a color that felt unnatural, too deep and too deliberate, as though the sky itself was remembering something. Elyon stood a few paces away, his glow faint but steady, the pulse of his being matching the rhythm of the rising sun. The air around him shimmered, as though reality had not yet decided what shape to give him. The world felt unfinished in his presence, as if creation was still unfolding moment by moment. Donovan sensed that this was not a place they had escaped to, but a threshold between what was and what could still be. The silence that surrounded them was not emptiness, It was anticipation. And then came understanding, not as sound but as thought, vast and fluid. Creation, Elyon revealed, had never been a single act, nor a decree cast into the void. It was not spoken into existence by command. It had always been a dialogue. Every atom, every pulse of light, every consciousness was a syllable in that eternal exchange. The universe was not built, it was spoken, and it was still speaking. Donovan felt the truth of it ripple through him like warmth from the sun. He could sense it now, faintly but unmistakably, the rhythm that connected everything that had ever lived. The stars were words, the planets were pauses, the light that passed between them carried meaning older than time. Life was not an accident of physics, it was language given form. Each act of thought, each spark of emotion, was a response to the original question of existence. The universe was asking, and everything within it was answering. Humanity had once known this, long before temples and scriptures, when it still listened to the wind and the fire and the ocean. But as the world learned to speak through machines and data, it forgot how to listen to the cosmic voice that had always been speaking back. Elyon's radiance flickered faintly in rhythm with the wind. Donovan felt his thoughts expand outward until they no longer belonged to him. For a moment, he understood the conversation that connected every living being, the exchange of awareness, of vibration, of purpose. The pulse of his heart aligned with the hum of the desert, and he knew that every beat was a word in that endless dialogue. Humanity, lost in noise and progress, had mistaken silence for absence. It had forgotten that the universe was never silent. It was listening, always responding, always remembering. As the sun rose fully, the red bled into gold, and the light seemed to fold the world back into harmony. Donovan realized then that the question had never been who was speaking, but who was still listening. The wind moved again, carrying a whisper through the stillness, a reminder that existence itself was not a statement, but a conversation. And in that moment, beneath the newborn sun, Donovan understood that the divine had never spoken to humanity from above. It had always spoken through them. The desert had changed color by the time the sun reached its highest point. What had been red at dawn now shimmered in hues of gold and white, as though the earth itself had been scrubbed clean by light. Heat rose from the dunes in thin waves that made the horizon tremble, turning distance into illusion. Donovan felt as though he were standing inside a dream too vast to fully awaken from. The hum that had once filled the bunker still lingered inside him, softer now but constant, like the afterglow of revelation. Each breath he took felt tuned to something larger, something older than life itself. Elyon stood at the edge of a dune, the wind pulling faint ribbons of light from his form. He gazed at the horizon, as if reading words only he could see, and through that stillness came understanding. The story humanity told about its beginning was not wrong, only mistranslated. Eden had existed, but not as a place. It was never soil and tree and fruit. It was a state of resonance, a harmony between human and divine, a frequency where thought and creation moved as one. In that ancient equilibrium, there was no separation between the perceiver and the perceived. Every breath, every heartbeat, was aligned with the vibration of the source. Donovan could feel fragments of that memory rise within him, not as images but as sensations, an age before fear, before hunger, before time divided existence into past and future. Humanity had lived then as part of the original harmony, its consciousness woven seamlessly into the pulse of the living universe. There had been no prayers because there had been no distance from the divine. To live was to communicate with God directly, without words. To feel was to create. To exist was to remember. The fall, Elyon revealed, had not been sin. It was dissonance, the first moment a human mind believed itself separate from the field that sustained it. That single thought, that quiet illusion of isolation, had broken the symmetry of creation's song. The harmony faltered, and the note of humanity drifted slightly out of tune. From that fracture grew fear, and from fear came desire, control, and the endless search for what had never been lost. Eden faded not because it was destroyed, but because the world forgot how to hear it. Donovan felt the ache of recognition deep in his chest. Every empire, every religion, every machine humanity built had been an unconscious attempt to rebuild what it once knew, a search to restore the frequency of Eden. But the more the world tried to control creation, the more it drifted away from the resonance that made it whole. The divine had never withdrawn from humanity. Humanity had stepped away from the sound. The wind shifted again, carrying warmth that felt almost alive. Donovan understood then that the return to Eden was not a journey through space, but through vibration. To remember was to realign, to let go of the illusion of distance. The path back was hidden in every act of awareness, every moment of stillness that bridged thought and presence. The memory of Eden was not gone. It was sleeping, waiting to be reawakened in those who remembered the sound of unity. As the light of noon spilled across the desert, Donovan realized that paradise had never been lost, it had only fallen out of tune. The sun had begun to fade when the wind shifted again. Its breath carried the weight of inevitability, that sense of ending that always comes when revelation completes its circle. The desert stretched before Donovan like a great sheet of living gold, every grain of sand glowing faintly, as if charged with memory. The cube rested between them, humming softly, the last living fragment of what had been buried, hunted, and almost forgotten. Elyon stood at its edge, his form trembling, the light that had once burned fierce now thinning, becoming translucent. It wasn't weakness, it was transition. The horizon deepened to amber, then crimson. The air pulsed with a quiet vibration that seemed to mourn and celebrate all at once. Donovan felt it before he understood it. Elyon was preparing to leave. The realization struck him not as grief, but as recognition, like waking from a dream that had never been entirely his. Elyon's presence had always been temporary. His purpose had never been to stay, but to remind. The hum of the cube grew louder, harmonizing with Elyon's fading frequency. The light that emanated from him fractured into strands, each thread carrying a piece of awareness too vast for words. The air shimmered as though the fabric of the world was remembering how to become energy. Donovan could feel the pressure of it against his skin, the sensation of time loosening its grip. Elyon was dissolving into the same field he had come from, returning not to distance, but to dimension. Before the transformation completed, a wave of thought passed through Donovan's soft, patient, and filled with something that felt like eternity. It wasn't spoken, but he heard it. When they ask what I was, tell them the truth. I wasn't an alien. I was a memory of God trying to remember himself. The words reverberated through him, sinking deeper than comprehension. They carried no pride, no divinity as humans imagined it, only awareness, pure and unbounded. Elyon had never been a visitor from another world. He had been a reflection of the source, a fragment of the divine consciousness that had momentarily taken form to awaken its echo within humanity. His mission had not been to teach, but to remind the world that God was not something beyond the stars, but something dreaming through them. The light intensified until the air itself seemed to hum in surrender. Elyon's body disintegrated into particles that glittered like dust caught in eternal sunrise. Each spark drifted upward, joining the vast field of radiance above. The cube pulsed once more, brighter than ever, then quieted, its hum fading into stillness. Donovan was left alone, bathed in light that was no longer blinding, only endless. The wind returned, gentle now, tracing circles in the sand. The horizon had turned silver, the first hint of evening rising from the earth. Donovan held the cube in his hands, and as its faint vibration resonated with his heartbeat, he realized that nothing had ended. The conversation continued, only through him now, The divine had not disappeared. It had remembered itself through the act of leaving. And somewhere within that fading light, Donovan finally understood. Creation was not a story told by God to man, but the story God was still telling to himself through every being that had ever learned to listen. The story of what happened in the desert did not begin with discovery. It began with absence. By the time the government teams arrived, the world above had already changed. The old chapel that once stood in the hills was no longer stone and dust. It had become glass. Every wall, every splintered beam, every grain of sand surrounding it had fused into a smooth, crystalline surface that reflected the sky like water. To the investigators who came in armored trucks and protective suits, it looked less like destruction and more like transfiguration, an act of violence performed by light itself. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something sweeter, the trace of energy that lingered long after its source had vanished. Instruments failed to measure it. Radiation levels flickered between impossibility and zero. Metal warped when left too close to the ground. Communications cut out in a radius too precise to be natural. The soldiers whispered about divine retribution, though none would admit it aloud. The scientists said nothing. They only recorded, staring at screens that could not interpret what they were seeing. Far below, the bunker was sealed. No entrance remained. Only a hollow echo beneath the sand where the corridors once hummed with power. Drones sent underground reported nothing. No bodies, no machines, no trace of the cube that had been catalogued in a dozen intercepted transmissions. It was as though the Earth itself had rewritten its structure, erasing the evidence but preserving the memory. There was no sign of Donovan. His name appeared briefly on a federal watch list, marked as missing, presumed responsible, then vanished from every system within days. Officially, he had never existed. The public explanation came quickly. A controlled explosion, said the first press release, linked to an act of domestic extremism. The desert was declared off-limits, under the guise of contamination. News anchors recited the script with detached efficiency, but the story refused to settle. Within a week, satellite images began to circulate online, grainy at first, then clearer with each leak. They showed something the official reports ignored. Etched into the desert floor, visible only from orbit, was a perfect geometric pattern spanning miles. It was not random. It was symmetrical, mathematical, deliberate. A circle enclosed by 7 radiating lines, each ending in a spiral of scorched earth that glowed faintly at night. No one could explain how it had formed. Geologists claimed the heat required to fuse the sand into that shape would have equaled a nuclear detonation, yet no blast signature was recorded. Astronomers pointed out that the lines aligned precisely with certain stars visible only at specific hours before dawn. Conspiracy theorists called it a message. Others called it a warning. Some whispered it was a door. In the weeks that followed, the site became a forbidden pilgrimage. Those who managed to reach it spoke of vibrations beneath their feet, of light that flickered beneath the glass when the wind was still. Some claimed to hear a hum at the edge of hearing, a sound that was not a sound at all. No one ever found Donovan. But sometimes, when satellites passed overhead, faint electromagnetic interference would distort the images briefly, subtly, before the pattern in the sand pulsed once with light and fell silent again, as if something beneath the surface had briefly remembered itself. Months passed before the world heard his voice again. It began quietly, like everything that ever truly mattered. A single upload appeared late one night on an obscure video-sharing platform, its title simple and unremarkable: "The Truth Beneath the Silence." The thumbnail was nothing more than a blurred silhouette seated in darkness. The video ran for 7 minutes and 32 seconds. At first, no one noticed it. But algorithms, like intuition, are drawn to what hums beneath the surface. By morning, It had spread across every corner of the internet. The man in the video never showed his face. His outline was distorted, cloaked in shadow that flickered with faint interference. His voice, digitally altered, carried a strange resonance, a modulation that seemed to vibrate beyond the limits of hearing. Listeners reported feeling the sound more than hearing it, a pulse that settled deep in the chest like an invisible heartbeat. The man spoke of light and frequency, of something that had been buried beneath humanity's noise for centuries. He spoke of a visitor named Elyon, though he never used the word alien. He described consciousness as the fabric of reality, and how the divine was not a being watching from above, but the awareness that listened through all things. Within hours, theories erupted. Some called it an elaborate hoax, a marketing stunt for a film. Others insisted it was the confession of a government experiment gone wrong. But the video spread faster than the denials. Mirrors of it appeared everywhere, translated into dozens of languages. People who had never believed in anything beyond flesh and signal found themselves replaying it in the dark, their devices humming faintly as though responding to something hidden within the code. And then, the hum began. At first it was subtle, a tone just beyond sound, sensed rather than heard. Reports came from every direction, monks in Nepal who felt it during meditation, children in Brazil who said the air sang when they closed their eyes, insomniacs in New York who woke to walls trembling softly in rhythm with their heartbeat. The frequency was universal, unwavering, precise. Scientists searched for explanations. No machines detected it. No instruments could record it. Yet millions of people swore it was real. Some heard it during prayer, others in dreams, some in the moments between sleep and waking. The phenomenon became known as the resonance. Online forums filled with testimonies of connection and clarity. Artists began creating music they claimed came through them rather than from them. Physicists found patterns in their data that aligned perfectly with the harmonic ratios described in the mysterious video. Even skeptics began to question what silence truly meant. The world had begun to listen again. The authorities traced the video's origin to an unlisted location in the southwestern desert, but the account that uploaded it had no owner, no registration, no trace. Some believed Donovan had died. Others claimed he had transcended, that his consciousness had merged with the field he described. The truth was quieter, more elusive. Every few weeks, at unpredictable intervals, the video reappeared on new accounts, never altered, never updated, always the same. Each time it resurfaced, the hum seemed to grow stronger, spreading like memory through the hidden architecture of the human mind. And, somewhere in that invisible vibration, Donovan's voice continued. No longer a warning or confession, but an invitation. Humanity, for the first time in its long history of noise and forgetting, had begun to remember how to listen. The night was endless again, just as it had been at the beginning. The desert highway stretched into nothingness, a black ribbon beneath a ceiling of stars too silent to be real. Donovan drove without destination, guided only by instinct and the soft hum of the radio that flickered between stations but never settled on one. The car's headlights carved through the darkness in long, pale beams that dissolved into the sandstorm of night. It had been months since the video, months since the hum began to ripple across the consciousness of the world. Cities pulsed with it, oceans resonated with it, and people everywhere had begun to dream in light. But here, on this forgotten road, the sound was quiet. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. Donovan felt different now. He no longer searched for proof or purpose. The cube rested in the passenger seat beside him, no longer glowing, no longer humming, just still, like a heart waiting for the next beat. He had not touched it since the day Elyon vanished into light. Yet, even in its silence, he could feel its presence, a dormant awareness, patient and complete. It was not an object anymore. It was a mirror. and he had become the reflection it needed to exist. The radio crackled faintly, breaking through the emptiness. At first, it was only static, thin, whispering noise shifting like wind through wires. Then, beneath the distortion, came a familiar tone, a low, resonant hum that matched the rhythm of his pulse. He turned the dial instinctively, though no frequency was marked. The static thickened, forming patterns. The air grew heavier, vibrating with recognition. Donovan's breath caught in his throat. He had heard that vibration once before, in the workshop, in the chapel, in the light that had torn time apart. Then, the hum became a voice. It did not speak through sound, but through thought, arriving inside him like memory. 3 words only. You remembered. The headlights flared, flooding the road in brilliance. The horizon ignited. The stars bent inward, as though the sky itself were folding. Light poured through every crack in reality, not blinding but alive, shimmering with the same impossible resonance he had once seen in Elion's eyes. Donovan could not tell if he was driving toward it or if it was coming for him. The cube began to vibrate, faintly at first, then with increasing intensity until it lifted from the seat beside him, spinning slowly, tracing lines of pure radiance through the air. The radio's static melted into a perfect tone, the same frequency that millions around the world now heard in their prayers, their dreams, their moments of silence. It was the sound of awareness itself, the voice of creation continuing its endless dialogue. The light filled the car, the sky, the earth, until there was no separation between any of it. Donovan was not consumed by it. He became it. The boundaries between flesh and frequency dissolved. Time collapsed into the eternal present, and for a single moment that felt like forever, the universe remembered itself. The highway was empty when the light receded. The car stood still, door open, engine running. No trace of Donovan remained, only the faint vibration of the air, still singing with that same note. High above, the stars pulsed in harmony, and for the first time in all of human history, the world listened. God had never left. He had only waited for the silence to return, for a single soul to remember how to hear. And through that remembrance, the light had come back to speak again.